How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. Like many of you, I enjoy The Lord of the Rings. The Games Workshop Middle-earth strategy battle game is actually what got me into the hobby of miniatures in the first place. These are some of the first minis I ever painted with my brother. We were 10 and 12. And while I may not be much better of a painter now, I am excited to repaint these and add them to a diorama. While looking through my old collection of minis, I found these unpainted dwarves, which is what inspired today's build. I rounded up all of the troops, but before doing any priming, I removed as much of the old paint as possible using some isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush. Once the minis were as paint-free as I was going to get them, I took them outside and I primed them on a pizza box. I will be painting all of these little guys later on in the video. To figure out the general size of this diorama, I measured the width of the minis in formation, and then I cut some pink foam off camera to match. I then began sketching out the different layers of this diorama. This diorama felt a little different than most, and it kind of felt like I was putting together the layers of a light box. Now, speaking of light boxes, you should definitely go check out Lightbox Life for some lightbox inspiration. The stuff she makes is really beautiful. I switched from my handheld hot wire to a hot wire table before doing the steps because I knew that it would be far easier to get a right angle. After cutting out a cardboard stencil, I taped that to the foam and I cut away the steps. If I had had a lower temperature on the wire, I probably could have achieved a cleaner cut on those steps, but they still turned out pretty good. I flipped the stencil over and I used it to cut out the steps on the other side as well. It's important to remember that whenever cutting foam with heat, you create fumes that are definitely not good for you. So make sure you have proper ventilation and airflow whenever you do something like this. I started cutting out the rest of the layers, going back deeper into the mine, adding a small hallway on the right and a doorway where some steps will be visible later on the left. The third layer of foam has some giant pillars holding up the roof in this section of the cave. To add some dimension, I cut up some nice thin strips of foam, which I added to the front of each of the pillars in 3 layers. This is a simple way of making convincing dwarven pillars with very little effort. Making these nice thin sheets of foam is a breeze on the hot wire table. I also used the nice thin sheet to make a frame around the doorway that leads to the stairway. After gluing the door frame into position, I made those steps off camera using that same stencil. I then glued the front 4 layers of foam together and I used a butane torch to scorch the roof of the cave so it looked more natural, blending all of the seam lines together. I then added a bridge and I glued the stairs into position. Then I glued the back 3 layers of foam together. I glued those to the front 4 layers of foam, and that was the construction done. The next step was to mix up and apply a terrain paste. I mixed up some plaster, paint, and Mod Podge. I thinned it down with some water, and I spread the protective layer over all of the foam. Come to think of it, I probably should have just used Mod Podge and paint to preserve more of the detail and the nice sharp edges on the foam. The thicker paste definitely softened some of the details, more than I would have preferred. When the terrain paste had thickened up a bit, I spread it around the back of the cave and filled in any obvious seams that I hadn't reached with the torch. I then covered everything with a layer of black paint and Mod Podge, and once that was dry, it was time to paint. Moria terrain was one of the first things that I ever tried to make for this game, so I repeated what I learned from my Mines of Moria book. I painted the pillars brown and then I dry brushed on shades of gray, going lighter and lighter, till you end up with something very stone-like. It's simple, but it's effective. It's very nostalgic to be making Mines of Moria stuff in this scale again. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more. I wanted to have some torches burning at the base of the pillars, so I used a nice long foam cutting tool to make a path for the wires to travel up through the pillars, as well as some channels in the foam to get the wires to the battery pack. I marked a spot for the housing to sit, and then I cut that out with my X-Acto knife and I glued it in place with some foam-safe super glue. For a nice fiery color and flickering effect, I used these electric tea light candles. I popped them out of their original housings and I just used the LEDs themselves. After harvesting the lamps, I soldered them to some new wires. I poked some holes in the pillars and I ran the flaming torch wires through the pillars down at the bottom of the base using the help of a brass rod that I temporarily soldered the wires onto. My brother is an electrician, and this is a technique that I picked up on after helping him install some lights in a bedroom one time. In each of the hallways, I used a flexible LED noodle, which I wired up in the same way. I tested my circuit to make sure everything was working before moving on. I used hot glue to create the flames above the torches. I made some handles for the torches using some toothpicks and little pieces of styrene tubing. After those torch handles had been constructed and painted, I glued them in place beneath the flames. The last thing to do for the base was to put some styrene sheets on the side, which I painted black off camera, and it was time to move on to painting the minis. Like I said at the beginning, these minis were my first endeavor into tabletop hobbies and miniatures. Without starting with these poorly painted minis, I don't know if I ever would have started Boylai Hobby Time all these years later. When the movies were released, I wanted a creative way to engage with Middle-earth, and these little miniatures helped me do that. Creating terrain and playing games with my friends was a large part of how I enjoyed the Lord of the Rings universe for a very long time. Shout out to Cameron, Than, Jims, Jonathan, Daniel, Andrew, Nacho, Uncle John, and my dad for being my Lord of the Rings gaming pals over the years. And sorry to everyone else who wasn't expecting this sentimental narration while I painted these goblins and dwarves. There's really not much else to say about painting goblins and dwarves, so I'll tell you what's happening in this diorama. Years after Durin had been killed by a Balrog and Moria had been abandoned, Balin decided to go back and try and reclaim Moria, but it didn't go very well. So this group of dwarves was with him, and this is their final stand. After all of the miniatures had been painted, the last thing to do was to glue everyone in place. Once everyone was in position, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.